They called him the Spare, a 22-year-old replacement pilot with a technical degree and no kills. He arrived at Leiston Airfield in December 1944 during the frozen chaos of the Battle of the Bulge. His logbook showed simulator hours and training circuits. His combat experience measured 0. The flight leader glanced at his personnel file and assigned him to the rear position. The armorer loading his guns didn't bother learning his name. Within 3 hours, Second Lieutenant Nelson Koch would be alone at 28,000 feet with a shattered canopy, a dying engine, and 14 FW-190s who believed they were hunting a cripple. December 1944. The Ardennes forest had become a killing ground, and the skies above it were no different. German fighters swarmed like wasps defending a burning nest, throwing everything they had left at the endless waves of American bombers. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots, but desperation made them vicious. They had learned to mass their attacks, to coordinate their dives, to overwhelm the escorts with sheer numbers. 14 against 1 was not a dogfight, it was an execution. The P-51 Mustang was a masterpiece of aerodynamic engineering, but its laminar flow wings demanded respect. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could outrun and outmaneuver anything Germany flew. In the hands of a rookie, its sensitivity was unforgiving. Veterans said you had to seduce a Mustang. You had to feel it, trust it, become part of its aluminum skin and Packard-built heart. Koch had studied the physics, he understood energy states and turn radii, but he had never felt the terror of a 20mm cannon shell punching through his windshield. Leiston Airfield sat in the cold mud of Suffolk, England, home to the 357th Fighter Group. These men had been grinding through the European air war for months. They had escorted bombers to Berlin and back. They had seen friends spiral into the North Sea trailing smoke. They measured mission success not in medals, but in how many of their squadron made it home for dinner. They were efficient, exhausted, and deeply suspicious of any pilot whose flight suit still smelled new. The ground crews worked through the pre-dawn darkness, coaxing temperamental Merlin engines to life, patching bullet holes with speed tape, draining the previous pilot's blood from seat cushions they would never mention. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with frost. Pilots pulled on leather jackets over electrically heated suits. They tested their oxygen, checked their gun sights, touched the photographs tucked into their breast pockets. They spoke in clipped sentences. Everything important had already been said. And then Nelson Koch, the soft-spoken engineering graduate who everyone assumed would wash out by New Year's, climbed into his assigned aircraft and discovered his radio could only receive. He could hear everything. He could say nothing. The Germans would never know he was listening, and that accident of failed electronics would turn a terrified rookie into the single most dangerous pilot in the winter sky.
Nelson Koch stepped off the transport truck into the December mud of Leiston with a duffel bag and a secret he couldn't share. He had graduated top of his class in aerodynamic theory. He understood Bernoulli's principle better than most of his instructors. He could calculate lift coefficients in his head while other pilots were still guessing at stall speeds. But none of that mattered here, because the 357th Fighter Group did not give diplomas for mathematics. The operations officer barely looked up from his clipboard. Koch was assigned to Major Riddle's flight as Tail End Charlie, the position reserved for men expected to die learning. No ceremony, no welcome speech, just a bunk number and a dismissive wave toward the flight line. In the corridor outside, 2 captains walked past him as if he were furniture. The invisible man had arrived. The P-51 Mustang waiting on the hardstand was the reason for the veterans' contempt, though Koch didn't realize it yet. North American Aviation had designed the fighter around a revolutionary laminar flow wing, a shape so precise that air molecules traveled across its surface in smooth, undisturbed sheets rather than the turbulent chaos of conventional airfoils. The result was breathtaking speed and range. The cost was sensitivity that bordered on cruelty. Where a Thunderbolt forgave sloppy stick work and a Spitfire tolerated ham-fisted corrections, the Mustang demanded symbiosis. Its controls were light, almost delicate. A quarter-inch of unnecessary movement translated into violent responses at high speed. Overcorrect in a turn, and the wing would snap roll. Yank the stick in a dive, and the airframe would shed rivets like scales. Veterans said flying a Mustang was like dancing with a woman who knew exactly how good she was and had no patience for amateurs stumbling over her feet. The crew chief who showed Koch to his assigned aircraft was a staff sergeant named Kowalski, a man whose knuckles were permanently stained with hydraulic fluid and whose faith in replacement pilots had died somewhere over Schweinfurt. He explained the pre-flight checklist with the enthusiasm of a mortician describing embalming techniques. When Koch asked about the laminar flow characteristics and boundary layer separation points, Kowalski stared at him for 3 full seconds. "Just don't break her before you die, Lieutenant." That night in the barracks, Koch lay in his bunk listening to men who had earned the right to sleep poorly. Nobody asked his name. In the 357th Fighter Group, you didn't exist until you survived your first mission. He was a ghost wearing second lieutenant bars, invisible until he proved he could bleed at altitude without taking someone else with him.
The klaxon shattered the pre-dawn silence at 0445 hours. Koch had been awake for 30 minutes already, staring at the ceiling and running through emergency procedures in his mind. Around him, veterans moved with the economy of men who had done this too many times. No rushing, no wasted motion. Just the quiet ritual of preparing to kill or be killed before breakfast. The briefing room smelled of coffee and wet wool. The intelligence officer pointed at a map with his wooden stick. Bomber stream heading to Koblenz. Expected fighter opposition heavy. The 357th would provide withdrawal support, picking up the B-17s as they limped back across the Rhine. Major Riddle would lead. Koch would fly number 4, the position farthest from the action and closest to nowhere. On the hard stand, his assigned Mustang sat in the morning frost, her name painted in fading letters beneath the canopy rail. Calculated risk. Kowalski was already there, finishing the final checks. He handed Koch the Form 1 without a word. Everything was green. Everything was lies. The ground crew didn't know what was broken until it killed you. The Packard Merlin coughed, backfired, then caught with a roar that vibrated through Koch's chest. He ran through the checklist by muscle memory, fingers dancing across switches and levers. Magnetos, fuel mixture, coolant temperature, oil pressure. The gauges told their small truths. But when he clicked the radio transmit button to check in with the tower, nothing happened. He toggled the switch again. Dead. He could hear the tower controller's voice crackling through his headset, hear Major Riddle confirming the flight's taxi clearance, hear the other pilots running through their radio checks. But when Koch pressed his transmit button, the indicator light didn't illuminate. He was receiving everything. He could send nothing. The line of Mustangs was already moving toward the runway. He had perhaps 90 seconds to make a decision. Abort the mission, report the malfunction, and confirm every suspicion that he was too cautious for combat. Or taxi into position and fly a fighter mission over Germany with no ability to communicate, to call for help, to warn his flight leader of threats he couldn't see. His hand hovered over the engine cutoff switch. Through his canopy, he could see Kowalski watching him, waiting to see if the rookie had the spine for it. Koch's throat was dry. His heart hammered against his ribs. He released the brakes and followed the aircraft ahead of him toward the runway. The invisible man was about to become truly alone. If you believe that no soldier should ever be left behind by their leaders, hit subscribe. Only those who side with cowards and traitors will scroll past. They crossed the Belgian border at 26,000 feet. 4 Mustangs in loose finger 4 formation against a sky that looked like hammered steel. The air was so cold that Koch's breath formed ice crystals on the inside of his oxygen mask. Below them, the Ardennes forest stretched like a dark scar across the frozen landscape, still burning in places from the German offensive that had turned Christmas into a slaughterhouse. Koch flew his position perfectly, maintaining spacing, scanning his assigned sector, watching Major Riddle's aircraft for hand signals since his radio could only receive. For 90 minutes, nothing happened, just the monotonous drone of the Merlin engine and the occasional crackle of radio chatter he couldn't answer. The bomber stream was 10 minutes ahead, already turning for home. Then Major Riddle's Mustang began trailing smoke. Not the thick black column of a combat hit, but the thin white streamer that meant coolant. Koch watched the flight leader's engine temperature gauge in his mind, knowing exactly what was happening. A failed seal, a cracked line, pressurized ethylene glycol vaporizing into the slipstream. Riddle had maybe 5 minutes before his engine seized into a 1,200-pound paperweight. Riddle's voice came through Koch's headset, tight with controlled urgency. "Hammer Flight, this is Lead. I'm losing coolant pressure. Descending for emergency landing at Y-29. 2, you have the flight. Return to base. Acknowledge." Koch heard the wingman confirm. He pressed his transmit button uselessly, the indicator light staying dark. Riddle's aircraft peeled away in a shallow dive toward the Allied airstrip at Ash. The remaining 3 Mustangs began their turn west, and that's when Koch saw it. 11 o'clock low, perhaps 8 miles distant, a B-17 Flying Fortress straggling behind the main formation, trailing smoke from her No. 3 engine. Her tail bore the 91st Bomb Group markings and a name Koch could just make out through his gun sight: Reluctant Dragon. She was alone, wallowing through the sky at maybe 180 miles per hour, a wounded animal separated from the herd. The standing order was absolute. Escort fighters stayed with the formation. Individual bombers were sacrifices to the arithmetic of war. 10 men in one fortress weighed less than hundreds in the mainstream. Koch's flight was already a mile ahead, climbing for altitude. They hadn't seen the straggler, or if they had, they were following doctrine. Through his headset, he heard the new flight leader calling taxi instructions for landing back at Leiston. Koch looked at the B-17. He looked at his departing flight. His hand tightened on the stick. Then he pushed the nose down and turned toward the dying bomber. Koch saw them before they saw him. 14 black crosses against the winter clouds, climbing in a loose gaggle formation toward the Reluctant Dragon. Focke-Wulf-190s, the Luftwaffe's brutish answer to American daylight bombing. Radial engines like clenched fists, cannons that could saw a bomber's wing off with a 2-second burst. He was 3,000 feet above them with the sun at his back. The textbook held 3,800 feet of pure gravitational potential energy that could be converted into kinetic velocity at a ratio his engineering professors had made him calculate until he dreamed in differential equations. The FW-190 could outroll any fighter in the European theater, snapping inverted and back again faster than a pilot could blink. But physics didn't care about roll rate. Koch pushed the stick forward and dove. The Mustang accelerated like a falling stone, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The airframe began to moan as the laminar flow wings carved through thickening air. Koch's vision narrowed at the edges from the building G-forces, but his hand on the throttle was steady. Energy management. Altitude was ammunition. Speed was life. He picked the trailing FW-190, the straggler in the German formation, and centered the illuminated pipper of his gun sight on the fat radial engine. At 400 yards, he pressed the trigger. 6 50-caliber machine guns shredded the silence. Tracers arced across the sky like red threads stitching death into aluminum. The Focke-Wulf's cowling disintegrated. Pieces of metal spun away, trailing smoke. The German formation scattered like startled crows. This was the equation the Luftwaffe pilots didn't understand. Koch had traded his altitude for 450 miles per hour of diving speed. The FW-190s were climbing at maybe 280. To intercept him, they would have to reverse their climb, bleed off their forward momentum, and pursue. By the time they completed that maneuver, Koch would already be climbing back to altitude, converting his speed back into potential energy like a pendulum swinging through its arc. Energy maneuverability. John Boyd's theories made flesh at 24,000 feet.
Koch pulled back on the stick, felt the G-forces slam him into his seat as the Mustang's nose pitched skyward. Blood drained from his head, gray fog crept across his vision. He grunted against the pressure, tensing his leg muscles to force circulation back to his brain. The altimeter spun upward. He had given away 3,000 feet in the dive. Now he was taking it back. Below him, the FW-190s were still trying to organize their counterattack, but Koch was already above them again, the sun still at his back, another 3,800 feet of potential death waiting to fall. The reluctant dragon limped onward, unaware that a ghost was fighting for her life. Comment, "I stand with the brave," if you think Nelson Koch was right to stay. Only trolls who enjoy seeing the underdog lose will stay silent.
Koch's radio crackled with a voice that wasn't American. Achtung, 1 auf 6, hoch. The transmission was frantic, clipped with fear. Koch's broken radio, trapped in receive mode, had picked up the German frequency. He was listening to the enemy coordinate their attack, hearing their tactical calls in real time, and they had no idea he could hear them. Another voice, older and steadier. Wo ist er? Ich sehe nichts. Where is he? I see nothing. Koch smiled grimly behind his oxygen mask. They couldn't see him because he was diving out of the sun, the oldest fighter tactic in the book made perfect by engineering precision. When a pilot looked toward a bright light source, his pupils contracted, creating a blind spot exactly where Koch positioned himself. The Mustang's polished aluminum skin reflected the winter sun like a mirror. To the Germans below, he was a ghost materializing from nowhere. He dove again. This time, he chose 2 FW-190s flying in tandem, both focused on the distant bomber. The mathematics were simple. Terminal velocity and a 60-degree dive from 28,000 feet gave him closure rate advantages the radial engine Focke-Wulfs couldn't match. He opened fire at 500 yards. The lead German's canopy exploded into glittering fragments. The fighter snap-rolled left and fell away streaming fire. The radio erupted in chaos. Der Geist kommt wieder! The ghost comes again! Koch pulled out of his dive, blood pooling in his boots from the G-forces, and climbed back into his perch. His ears filled with German voices, no longer coordinated but fragmenting into individual panic. They thought they were fighting multiple attackers, one lone Mustang attacking with such precision, such calculated aggression, didn't fit their combat model. Wie viele sind es? How many are there? Ich weiß es nicht. 3? 4? Koch listened to them trying to reorganize, hearing the fear infecting their tactical discipline. The flight leader was shouting commands, but his subordinates were scattered across 5,000 feet of altitude, each pilot scanning different quadrants of sky, searching for an enemy who attacked from everywhere and nowhere. One young voice cut through the radio chatter, nearly breaking. Ich kann ihn nicht finden. Ist überall. I can't find him. He's everywhere. Koch checked his fuel gauge. He had maybe 20 minutes before he would have to break off and run for the Allied lines. 20 minutes to convince 14 veteran German pilots that they were being hunted by a squadron of ghosts rather than one lone rookie in a broken airplane. He rolled inverted, pulled the nose through the horizon, and dove again. This time, he heard them scream.
Koch had made a mistake, and at 27,000 feet, mistakes were measured in fractions of seconds between living and dying. He had fixated on his target, a FW-190 with yellow spinner markings that indicated a Staffel leader. The tunnel vision that came with combat had narrowed his scan pattern. He didn't see the other Focke-Wulf climbing vertically from his 4 o'clock low, didn't register the muzzle flashes until the 20mm cannon shells were already crossing the distance between them at 3,000 feet per second. The first round missed. The second punched through his right wing, leaving a fist-sized hole in the aluminum skin. The third hit the plexiglass canopy 18 inches above his head. The world exploded. The reinforced acrylic disintegrated into 1,000 fragments that turned the cockpit into a blizzard of razor-edged shrapnel. Koch felt the impacts across his face and neck, hot needles of pain that were instantly numbed by the 70 below zero air that roared through the shattered canopy at 380 miles per hour. His oxygen mask tore partially away. Blood from a dozen small cuts froze on his skin before it could drip. The wind noise was apocalyptic, a sustained shriek that made thinking impossible. Koch's eyes watered instantly from the freezing air, tears turning to ice crystals on his eyelashes. He couldn't hear his engine. He couldn't hear the radio. He couldn't hear anything except the banshee scream of the slipstream trying to tear him from the cockpit. His vision blurred. Hypoxia was coming. At this altitude, without a sealed oxygen mask, he had maybe 2 minutes of useful consciousness before his brain began shutting down. The equation was brutal and simple: descend or die. But below him, the reluctant dragon was still there, still limping toward home, still carrying 10 men who didn't know a ghost was bleeding for them. Koch tasted blood in his mouth. The wind had cracked his lips, and the salt copper taste mixed with the rubber smell of his damaged oxygen mask. He grabbed the dangling mask with his left hand, pressed it against his face, and held it there with sheer force of will. Every breath was a knife in his frozen lungs. Through the jagged opening where his canopy had been, he could see the German fighters regrouping. They had seen him get hit. They knew he was wounded. In the cruel mathematics of aerial combat, a damaged enemy was priority prey. Koch pulled the stick hard left, kicked the rudder, and turned back toward them. His scream of defiance was lost in the wind, but his intent was not. The ghost wasn't finished bleeding yet. Hit subscribe if you can't stand bullies who use their numbers to crush the weak. People who support the black swarm tactics won't subscribe. The German flight leader's voice cut through the radio static with an edge Koch had never heard before. Not anger, not frustration, fear. Alle Flugzeuge sammeln und ausweichen, sofort. All aircraft, bather and disengage, immediately. Koch didn't understand German fluently, but he understood the tone. Something had broken in the enemy commander's tactical calculus. Through his frozen, blood-streaked goggles, Koch watched the remaining FW-190s begin to turn away from the reluctant dragon, abandoning their attack run to climb toward a rally point. They were retreating. From him. Another voice on the German frequency, younger and defiant. Herr Hauptmann, wir haben ihn getroffen. Ist beschädigt. Captain, we hit him. He's damaged. The flight leader's response was a roar that distorted the transmission. Ich befehle Rückzug. Das ist ein Hinterhalt. I order withdrawal. This is an ambush. Koch understood that word. Hinterhalt. Ambush. The German commander thought he had led his Stoffel into a trap, that the lone Mustang attacking with such impossible aggression was bait for a larger force. No sane pilot would continue fighting after taking a canopy hit at 27,000 feet. Therefore, this pilot was either insane or part of a coordinated attack. The Germans had chosen to believe the latter because the alternative was worse. Aber Herr Hauptmann, but Captain, Ruhe, Abbruch der Mission, folgt mir nach Hause. Silence, abort the mission, follow me home. Koch watched through the shattered remains of his canopy as 8 Focke-Wulf 190s, each flown by veterans with months or years of combat experience, turned southeast and ran. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a strategic repositioning, a rout. They were fleeing from a single American pilot whose face was a frozen mask of blood and ice. The irony would have made Koch laugh if his lungs had enough oxygen. He had spent his entire military career being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as expendable furniture in the squadron ready room. Now he had become so terrifying that 14 German fighters had been reduced to 8 fleeing survivors who would return to their base and file reports about a ghost squadron that attacked from the sun. The reluctant dragon continued westward, her crew never knowing how close they had come to disintegration. Koch could see the waist gunners moving in the fuselage, probably counting their own battle damage, unaware that a rookie they would never meet had just spent his youth and his blood to buy them a few more hours of life. Koch's altimeter read 25,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 18 minutes remaining. His engine temperature was climbing toward the red line, and his oxygen mask, held against his face by his left hand, was slowly freezing to his skin. Time to go home. If he could find it.
The coolant temperature gauge had been kissing the red line for 3 minutes. Now it was buried past the maximum marking, the needle pressed against the physical stop as if trying to escape the instrument panel entirely. Koch could smell it before he saw it, the sweet, toxic scent of boiling ethylene glycol vaporizing through stress cracks in the engine cowling. The Packard Merlin was eating itself from the inside. Coolant circulated through the engine block to prevent the 12 cylinders from melting into slag. Without coolant, the aluminum pistons would expand from heat, seize against the cylinder walls, and turn 1,490 horsepower into a 1,650-pound anchor. Koch had perhaps 5 minutes before catastrophic failure, maybe less. The manifold pressure gauge showed 61 inches of mercury, maximum continuous power. Every pound of pressure above 46 inches was borrowed time, extra performance squeezed from an engine designed for brief bursts of combat emergency power, not sustained abuse. But Koch needed every bit of thrust to maintain altitude with the drag from his shattered canopy clawing at the airframe. He eased the throttle back. The manifold pressure dropped to 52 inches. The engine temperature stopped climbing, hovering just below the point where metal turned liquid. But the Mustang's airspeed bled away. 280 miles per hour, 260, 240. The controls felt mushy. He was approaching the edge of the laminar flow wing's efficiency range. The mathematics were cruel. Too much power and the engine would seize. Too little power and he would stall and spin into the frozen Belgian countryside. He needed to find the equilibrium point, the precise manifold pressure that would keep the Merlin alive long enough to cross the front lines without falling from the sky. Koch adjusted the throttle in quarter-inch increments, watching 3 gauges simultaneously: manifold pressure, coolant temperature, airspeed. 48 inches. The temperature stabilized. The airspeed held at 245. The engine note changed from a scream to a labored growl, each cylinder firing with the mechanical desperation of a dying heart. Below him, the landscape was changing. The dense Ardennes forest gave way to open farmland, then to the cratered moonscape of the front lines. He could see the trenches, the burned-out tanks, the artillery impact zones that marked the boundary between German occupation and Allied territory. 12 miles. He needed 12 more miles. The engine coughed, a single misfire that sent a shudder through the airframe. Koch's hand tightened on the stick. Not yet. Not when he was this close. He whispered to the airplane, a prayer to aluminum and engineering that had no business working, but somehow still flew. Just 12 more miles. That's all I need. 12 more miles. The engine coughed again. This time it didn't stop. If you despise gatekeepers who tell young people they aren't good enough, hit subscribe to prove them wrong. Only the gatekeepers themselves will ignore this. The engine died at 1,200 feet over Allied territory. No warning, no final cough of defiance, just sudden silence as the Packard Merlin transformed from a precision instrument into dead weight. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream, generating drag but no thrust. Koch had become a glider pilot. Below him, a dirt landing strip appeared through the haze, one of the forward airfields hastily carved from Belgian farmland to support the Bulge counteroffensive. It was short, rough, and currently home to a scattered collection of C-47 transports. It was his only option. The Mustang's glide ratio was 8-to-1. He had perhaps 90 seconds of controlled flight remaining. No radio to call the tower. No engine to execute a go-around if he misjudged the approach. Just physics and the laminar flow wings that had kept him alive this long. Koch lined up on final approach with hands that could no longer feel the stick. His left hand was still frozen to his oxygen mask. His face had gone numb an hour ago. The airspeed indicator showed 120 miles per hour, barely above stall speed with the added drag from his shattered canopy. The ground rose to meet him. He flared at the last moment, bleeding off speed, and the Mustang's wheels kissed the frozen earth with a jolt that sent lightning through his spine. The tail dropped. He had no brakes. The hydraulic pressure had bled away somewhere over Germany. The fighter rolled down the dirt strip, shedding velocity through friction and prayer.
calculated risk came to rest 50 feet from a startled group of transport pilots. Cock tried to open the canopy, but his hands wouldn't obey. Men were running toward him, shouting words he couldn't hear through the ringing in his ears. Someone climbed onto the wing, looked through the shattered plexiglass, and went pale. They pulled him from the cockpit like extracting a corpse. His legs wouldn't support his weight. When they tried to remove his oxygen mask, frozen blood and skin came with it. His face was a grotesque mask of ice, oil, and dried blood. His eyes were the only human features visible, and they stared at nothing.
A medic appeared with a blanket. Someone else counted the bullet holes in the Mustang's skin. 27. The crew chief who examined the engine shook his head in disbelief. The coolant reservoir was empty, the cylinder head cracked, the pistons scored beyond repair. By the time they got coach to the aid station, word was already spreading. A replacement pilot, solo engagement, 14 FW-190s, 6 confirmed kills, brought them all home with a dead engine and no canopy. When the report reached Leiston that evening, the operations officer read it twice, then looked at the duty roster. "Nelson Coach," he said quietly, "the invisible man." Staff Sergeant Kowalski, standing nearby, allowed himself the smallest smile. "Not anymore, sir. Not anymore." Nelson Coach proved that heart beats numbers every single time. If you believe in justice over power, like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and comment "Never back down" below to show you're part of the resistance against the bullies of the world.